I never thought I'd be standing in a kitchen this quiet, holding a mug of coffee gone cold, wondering how a single moment could split a life so cleanly into before and after. Before my husband died, our home felt like a small universe held together by laughter, footsteps, and the sound of two people breathing in sync. After, after felt like learning how to walk again with someone missing beside me. Maybe you've been through a loss like that. The kind that doesn't knock first, doesn't ask permission, doesn't care about your plans or the promises you thought time owed you. It arrives like a storm, and when it leaves, everything looks the same, yet nothing feels familiar. It happened in late autumn. The leaves outside were turning rust red and gold, and he had said just a day earlier how he wanted to rake them into piles so our little girl, Emma, could jump through them. He always made sure she had moments like that, small, silly things that somehow became the memories you cling to when the world becomes unrecognizable. The morning he passed, I was standing at the front door, tying Emma's shoelaces for preschool. I remember him leaning down to kiss the top of her head. He whispered, "Be good for your mom today, all right?" She giggled and wrapped her arms around his neck. I didn't know then, how could I, that it would be the last time she'd ever hug him. He left for work like he always did. He waved from the driveway, and I raised my hand automatically, the way I had for years. If I had known, maybe I would have run outside. Maybe I would have hugged him too. But life doesn't give you rehearsals, only memories. The call came an hour later. A voice from the hospital, kind but trembling, as if even the caller wished they could change the words they had to say. I don't know how long I stood there after the phone slipped from my hands. The house seemed to tilt, the walls pressing in, the world shrinking into a single sentence I wasn't ready to understand. He's gone. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about bills or funeral arrangements or the years ahead. I was thinking about Emma, about how I'd look into her small, trusting eyes and tell her that her father, the man who made her feel safe in every storm, would never walk through our door again. That was the day everything changed. The day I became a mother alone. The day I realized strength is something you find only when there's no other choice. The weeks that followed my husband's passing were quieter than anything I had ever known. The house felt too big, too still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Every sound became louder, the kettle clicking, the floor creaking, even my own footsteps echoing back at me. I remember sitting at the kitchen table one morning, staring at the mug in my hands, wondering how a home could feel so suddenly foreign. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt familiar. I kept expecting him to walk through the door or call my name from the hallway the way he always did. I would find myself turning my head when a car door shut outside, thinking for a moment that he had come back. Grief plays strange tricks like that. It takes what you know is real and makes you doubt it for a moment. My heart kept reaching for something my mind already understood was gone. Our daughter, Emily, was only 8 at the time. She had her father's eyes, soft brown, always shining with curiosity. But after he died, there was a quietness in her that I had never seen before. She didn't cry much. Instead, she watched me closely, as if waiting for my permission to break down. Children can be so much stronger than we realize, and yet so fragile in ways we can't always see. Every night, she would climb into my bed, curling into the space her father used to sleep in. She'd whisper, "Mom, it's okay if you cry. Daddy would understand." I would stroke her hair gently, trying to be the strong one, even when I felt like I was falling apart inside. There were moments when her small hand in mine was the only thing keeping me grounded. Before he passed, our life had been simple and steady. We lived in a small suburban town in North Carolina. The kind where everyone knew everyone, and the neighbors waved as they mowed their lawns. My husband worked as an electrician, always coming home with stories about the people he met and the repairs he had to perform. I stayed home with Emily, working part-time at the library and volunteering at her school whenever I could. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was ours. Soft, warm, and filled with small routines that made it feel safe. Losing him shattered more than my heart. It broke the rhythm of everything we knew. Meals tasted different, mornings felt heavier, nights stretched on too long. And the hardest part was realizing that I had to guide Emily through her grief while drowning in my own. Some days I wasn't sure I was strong enough for that. But life doesn't wait for us to be ready. Bills still came. School letters still needed responses. Groceries still needed to be bought, even when the simple act of walking through the aisles made my chest ache. I had to learn, day by day, what it meant to be both mother and father. It wasn't a role I wanted, but it was one I had no choice but to accept. People dropped off meals at first, offering condolences and soft hugs at the door. They'd say things like, "If you need anything, let us know." But the calls faded within weeks. The world kept moving around us, while ours stood painfully still. I realized then that grief is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet, lingering in the corners of your home and your heart. Still, I tried to keep things steady for Emily. I made sure we read bedtime stories, even when my voice shook. I packed her lunches with little notes inside, telling her, "Be brave," or "I love you more than the sun loves the sky." Those small things mattered. They reminded me that even in sorrow, there were pieces of love still left to hold on to. But there were also challenges I never expected. Long conversations with social workers, financial worries I didn't know how to solve, and nights where I lay awake wondering if Emily would grow up resenting the life we were forced into. The fear of failing her was heavier than the grief itself. I wanted to keep her safe, to give her stability, to show her she was loved even when our world had fallen apart. And yet, beneath all the pain, there was a quiet determination growing inside me. I didn't recognize it at first, but it was there, a small, steady strength whispering that we would get through this one day at a time. Losing my husband broke me, but raising our daughter alone would become the journey that reshaped me. That was the beginning of everything, the start of the story I never imagined living, the one that tested my spirit and softened my heart at the same time. And as the days unfolded, I realized that grief does not end, but it changes. It becomes something we learn to carry with grace. As the months passed, Emily and I settled into a new rhythm, though it never felt quite right. It was as if our lives had been stitched back together with threads too thin to hold forever. Some days felt almost normal, but others reminded me sharply of everything we had lost. Things that used to be simple, school mornings, grocery trips, even loading the dishwasher, now felt heavier. Grief had become a silent companion, following us everywhere, even on the days I tried to ignore it. Emily struggled in her own quiet ways. She stopped raising her hand in class and started sitting alone at recess. Her teachers told me she seemed distant, easily startled, and unwilling to speak unless spoken to. At home, she clung to routines that reminded her of her father, the same cereal he used to pour for her, the same bedtime song he hummed off-key. Watching her try to hold on to pieces of him made my heart ache, because I was doing the same thing. We were both trying to keep him alive and the only ways we knew how. Financially, things began to tighten faster than I expected. My husband's life insurance had helped at first, but between mortgage payments, repairs, school field trips, and the everyday expenses of raising a child, I could feel it disappearing. I knew I needed more work, but the thought of leaving Emily alone after school scared me. She was still so fragile, still waking up at night from dreams she refused to describe. Yet, reality didn't wait for me to be ready. Bills didn't soften themselves for widows. I sat at the kitchen table one evening, sorting through envelopes with trembling hands. The electric bill, the school field trip payment, a notice about an overdue car repair. It all stacked up like a quiet accusation, reminding me that love alone could not keep the lights on. I felt panic rising in me, a tightness in my throat that made it hard to breathe. I didn't cry, though. I couldn't. There were too many things that needed me to stay strong. I found a part-time job at a local cafe, a small place with chipped mugs and warm yellow lighting. The owner, Martha, was a kind woman in her 60s, the type who could sense pain without having to ask. She gave me flexible hours and always made sure I left with a meal for Emily. I was grateful, truly, but the exhaustion began creeping into my bones. I would come home after closing shift smelling like coffee and steam, my feet aching, my shoulders heavy. Emily would be waiting at the kitchen table with her homework spread out, pretending she hadn't fallen asleep in that chair hours before. I'd gently lift her chin, tuck her hair behind her ear, and tell her, "I'm here now." She would smile in that small, quiet way she had developed lately, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Those moments were both beautiful and heartbreaking. The first signs of real strain started showing when her school counselor requested a meeting. I sat in a small office with soft lighting and children's drawings pinned to every wall. The counselor, Mrs. Rose, folded her hands on the desk and spoke gently. "Your daughter is grieving, and grief shows up differently in every child. She is withdrawing. She has trouble concentrating. She seems lost." The way she said lost felt like a gentle tap against a bruise. I nodded, swallowing the guilt rising in my chest. "I'm trying," I whispered, ashamed at how fragile my voice sounded. "I really am." "I know," she said kindly, "but she needs more than comfort. She needs structure, stability, and she needs to see you caring for yourself, too." I nodded, although I didn't know how to do that. How could I take care of myself when everything depended on me not falling apart? When the empty side of the bed reminded me every night that I was doing this alone? Around that same time, small things around the house began to break. The faucet leaking, the porch light flickering, the washing machine making a strange rattling noise. Things my husband used to fix without a second thought. I tried to figure it out on my own, watching tutorials on my phone, fumbling with tools. As winter settled in, the cold seemed to seep into every corner of our lives. The house felt draftier somehow, as though grief had opened tiny cracks I hadn't noticed before. I kept the heat lower to save on bills, layering Emily in blankets at night and tucking her close to her stuffed animals. She never complained, but sometimes I'd wake to find her curled tight, as if trying to make herself smaller against the world. Children shouldn't have to feel that kind of cold, not on their skin and not in their hearts. The loneliness became something I carried like a physical weight. There were evenings when the silence in the house felt so loud that I put on the radio just to drown out my own thoughts. Even simple things, choosing what to cook, planning the week ahead, looking at the empty seat across the table, became reminders of what I had lost. I missed having someone to share decisions with, someone to lean on, someone to say, "It's going to be all right," even if it wasn't. I missed the balance we had built together, the way he'd soften the moments when I felt overwhelmed. One night, as I tucked Emily into bed, she looked up at me with tired eyes. "Mom, why do you always look sad when you think I'm not watching?" Her honesty cut through me like a soft knife, gentle but painfully true. I didn't know what to say, so I brushed her hair from her forehead and whispered, "I'm just tired, sweetheart, but I'm here. I'm always here." She nodded, but I could tell she didn't fully believe me. A few days later, the school called again. Emily had gotten into a small argument with another child who teased her about not having a dad at the Christmas show. When the teacher told me, I felt a heat rise in my chest, not anger at the other child, but heartbreak that Emily had to face questions she was too young to understand. I picked her up early that day, and she climbed into the back seat quietly, staring out the window with her hands folded in her lap. I reached back to touch her knee and said softly, "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to." She shook her head. "Not today," she whispered. At the cafe, I began picking up extra shifts whenever I could. Martha saw the strain in my eyes but didn't comment. She would simply hand me a warm muffin or slip an extra few dollars in my pay envelope, pretending it was a mistake. I appreciated her kindness, but it didn't erase the fatigue that settled deeper every day. I felt like a candle burning at both ends, flickering but refusing to go out. Then came the night the car wouldn't start. The engine coughed, sputtered, and fell silent. I tried again, but it only made a sad clicking sound that reminded me of a door locking. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, my breath fogging the windshield. Emily was in the passenger seat, clutching her school backpack to her chest. I said, "It's okay," softly, forcing calm into my voice. "We'll walk." She nodded, trusting me in that quiet way she always did. We walked the whole way home, a 25-minute stretch through cold air that felt like it cut through my coat. Emily shivered, so I wrapped my scarf around her neck, tucking it in gently as we went. With each step, I felt the worry tighten in my stomach. Another repair, another bill, another weight added to the pile already threatening to tip. When we finally got home, I warmed her a bowl of soup and told her to change into her pajamas while I stepped outside to call a mechanic. The quote he gave me made my knees weak. I thanked him and hung up, sinking onto the porch steps as the cold bit through my jeans. I rubbed my hands together, trying to quiet the panic rising in my chest. But I couldn't fall apart, not in front of her. A week later, I found Emily crying in her room, her small shoulders shaking. I knelt beside her, smoothing her hair as she tried to hide her face. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" I asked gently. It took a few minutes for her tears to slow. She looked up at me with trembling lips and whispered, "I don't want you to die too." My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't realized how deeply she had absorbed her father's loss, how afraid she was of losing me as well. I held her for a long time that night, rocking her gently until she fell asleep. After I carried her to bed, I stood in her doorway watching her small body rise and fall with each breath. The thought of her losing me, of this little girl facing the world alone, filled me with a fierce determination I hadn't felt in months. I knew then that I needed to find a way to be her anger, even if I was still learning how to stand steady myself. But grief has a way of testing you just when you think you've found your footing. On a Tuesday afternoon, the landlord left a notice on the door, a polite but unmistakable warning that if I didn't catch up on payments soon, we risked losing the house, the place where my daughter took her first steps, the place where my husband's laugh once filled the hallways, the place we were trying so hard to keep alive. I held the notice in my hands, staring at the words until they blurred. For a moment, it felt like the world was closing in on us again. But just as fear began to rise in my chest, Emily came to the doorway holding one of her storybooks. "Mom," she asked softly, "will you read to me?" Her voice was so small, so trusting. I folded the notice behind my back, forced a smile, and said, "Of course, sweetheart." Because even in the thickest parts of grief, motherhood doesn't pause, and love, the quiet, everyday kind, doesn't let you surrender. As the days stretched into weeks, I noticed Emily beginning to carry her grief in quieter ways. She didn't cry as much, but she grew more watchful, studying me as if she were afraid that I might disappear if she blinked too long. She followed me from room to room, sitting nearby while I folded clothes or washed dishes. Sometimes she would slip her hand into mine without saying a word, as if the contact itself kept the world steady for her. It reminded me how fragile children are beneath their brave faces. I tried to be gentle with her and firmer with myself. Each morning I woke up a little earlier, preparing breakfast before waking her. I wanted her to feel a sense of rhythm again, something predictable in the midst of so much change. Even when my eyes stung with exhaustion, I forced myself to keep the house tidy, the laundry done, the routines stable. It wasn't really about the chores, it was about giving my daughter a world that didn't feel like it was falling apart. But holding everything together on the inside was harder. At night, after Emily was asleep, I often sat on the edge of my bed, rubbing my temples or staring at the ceiling. Some nights, I would open my husband's drawer, the one I hadn't emptied since he passed, and breathe in the faint scent of his cologne. Grief was strange like that. You could be fine one minute and suddenly undone by something as small as a button or a ticket stub in an old pocket. Emily's school counselor recommended a grief support group for children, held every Wednesday afternoon. At first, Emily refused. When I mentioned it gently over dinner, she shook her head and said in a tight voice, "I don't want people talking about Dad." Her small hands tightened around her fork, and I could see the storm building behind her eyes. I reached across the table and rubbed her knuckles softly. "No one will make you speak," I murmured. "You can just listen. You don't have to do anything that feels too big." She didn't answer, but the next Wednesday, she quietly put on her coat. The group was held in a community center room with soft lighting and beanbag chairs. Parents waited in a separate space, so I sat with other mothers and fathers, each of us grieving in our own corner of silence. Some had lost spouses, others children, siblings, or parents. In that room, no one pretended to be okay. No one wore the strong face we showed the outside world. There was a strange comfort in that honesty. When Emily came out after her first session, her eyes were red, but her shoulders were less tense. She climbed into the back seat and whispered, "Can we come again next week?" I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. It wasn't a solution, but it was a beginning, a small crack of light in the heavy dark. Meanwhile, my work hours grew longer. The cafe was short-staffed, and Martha depended on me more each week. I didn't mind the extra hours because they meant a slightly easier month, but they also meant I saw less of Emily. Some evenings, I came home to find her asleep on the couch with her backpack still by her side. I would lift her gently into bed and sit there for a few minutes, brushing her hair from her face, feeling guilty for every moment I wasn't beside her. One Friday evening, after an especially long shift, I walked into the house to find the living room lights off and only the glow of the kitchen lamp visible. Emily was sitting at the table with a coloring book, her head down. When she looked up, her eyes were puffy. "I thought you forgot to come home," she whispered. Her voice cracked in a way I had never heard before. My chest tightened painfully. I crouched beside her and pulled her into my arms. "I would never forget you. Not ever," I murmured. She clung to me, her small body shaking. I realized then that she wasn't just grieving the father she lost. She was terrified of losing the mother she still had. After that night, I rearranged my hours as best I could. I asked Martha for fewer closing shifts, even if it meant less money. I needed to be home for bedtime, for dinner, for the little moments that made Emily feel safe. Martha understood without needing a long explanation. "Family comes first," she said softly, "especially now." Even with the adjustments, the pressure kept building. One morning, I found a letter from the mortgage company reminding me of the payments I was behind on. I folded it quickly and slid it into a drawer, not wanting Emily to see. I felt like I was constantly playing a quiet game of survival, patching one hole only for another to open. Then came the day Emily overheard a conversation she wasn't meant to hear. I was on the phone with the bank, discussing a possible extension. My voice was low, strained. When I hung up, I turned to see her standing in the doorway, hugging her stuffed rabbit to her chest. "Are we going to lose our house?" she asked, her voice trembling so much it barely sounded like her. I felt my heart break. All over again. I crossed the room quickly, kneeling so I could look her in the eyes. "No, sweetheart," I whispered, though inside I wasn't sure. "I will figure it out, I promise." She stared at me for a long moment, searching my face for truth. Finally, she nodded, but I could see the worry hadn't fully left her eyes. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a pen and paper, listing every possible option I could think of. Cut expenses, sell old furniture, pick up freelance work, anything. I was determined to protect her, not from the truth, but from the fear of losing everything twice in one lifetime. But life has a way of testing you just when you're beginning to stand again. And the test that was coming, the one I didn't see approaching, would change everything for both of us. The turning point in our struggle didn't arrive loudly or dramatically. It slipped into our lives quietly, the way small troubles often do. It started with a notice in Emily's school folder, a reminder about the upcoming spring field trip, something she had been talking about for months. The cost wasn't extravagant, but it was more than I could manage that week. When she handed me the paper with a hopeful smile, I felt my heart twist. I didn't want to crush her excitement, but I wasn't sure how I would make it work. That evening, Emily sat on the floor with her crayons, drawing a picture of herself on the field trip bus. She added little details she knew from the permission slip: the museum, the picnic space, the gift shop. Her soft humming filled the room, innocent and warm. I watched her from the kitchen, feeling both love and fear swell inside me. The truth was simple and heavy. Even small joys had become things I had to fight for. I stayed up late that night going over my budget again and again. I cut out everything I could: streaming services, eating out, even the small treats I sometimes bought for Emily after a hard day. When I finally found a way to make the field trip payment fit, it meant letting another bill slide further behind. It felt like choosing which leak to plug in a sinking boat. But when I placed the signed permission slip into her backpack the next morning, the look on her face made the sacrifice feel worth it. It was the week of the field trip when the situation at work began to shift. A new manager was brought into the cafe, a younger man named Dennis, who cared more about efficiency than empathy. He rearranged schedules, cut shift hours, and insisted on strict rules that left no room for flexibility. On his first day, he pulled me aside and asked about my availability. When I explained I needed to be home in the evenings for my daughter, he raised an eyebrow as though my reason wasn't valid. "We'll see what we can do," he said, with a tone that made me uneasy. Within days, Dennis began reducing my hours. He scheduled me for midday shifts when tips were lower and customers fewer. It felt deliberate, though I didn't want to believe it. I tried to stay grateful for the hours I still had, but each time I left the cafe with a lighter envelope, the knot in my stomach grew tighter. I needed the job, yet I could feel it slipping out of my hands. One afternoon, I came home earlier than usual and found Emily sitting on the couch with her knees pulled to her chest. Her backpack lay beside her, untouched. When she looked up, her eyes were red. "Mom," she whispered, "can we talk?" I set my keys down slowly and sat beside her, giving her time to gather her words. After a long pause, she said, "Something happened at school." A child in her class had told her that kids with no dads are different. I felt something heavy settle in my chest as she continued. "He said families like ours are sad." She looked at me with tears pooling in her eyes and whispered, "Mom, are we sad?" The question struck deeper than any insult. I pulled her close, pressing her head gently against my shoulder. "We're not sad," I murmured. "We're healing, and healing is something brave people do." But inside, I wondered if she saw through the words I wrapped around her pain. The next morning, Emily hesitated before going into school. She held my hand a little too tightly, as though she wanted to say something but couldn't. I knelt beside her and said softly, "You're not alone, sweetheart. You have me, always." She nodded, but I could feel the trembling in her fingers. Losing her father had shaken the ground beneath her, and the world felt too big, too full of reminders. Stress began affecting her in other ways too. She struggled with sleep again, waking from bad dreams she couldn't fully describe. Some nights she would sit up suddenly, breathing quickly, her eyes wide and frightened. I would take her hand and whisper, "It's just a dream. I'm here." But her small body would stay tense for a long time before she finally relaxed. All the while, bills continued to pile up, and my hours kept shrinking. I tried applying for other jobs, but everything decent required hours that would leave Emily alone late into the evening. That wasn't an option. I refused to choose financial stability over my daughter's emotional well-being, even if it meant stretching myself thinner than ever before. Motherhood, I was learning, was a long series of choosing your child first, even when the world punished you for it. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult day at work, I returned home to find an envelope taped to our front door. It was from the mortgage company. The wording was colder this time, more urgent. I stood on the porch reading it, my hands trembling. We were officially at risk. If I didn't make a payment soon, they would begin formal steps toward repossession. My chest tightened, and for a moment I thought I might collapse right there on the steps. I walked inside quietly, not wanting Emily to see the panic on my face. She was in the living room drawing another picture. This one showed our house with flowers in front and a bright sun overhead. She looked up at me and smiled. "Look, Mom," she said softly, "I drew a happy home." My throat tightened. I kissed the top of her head and whispered, "It's beautiful, sweetheart." I didn't let her see how my hands shook. That night, after she went to bed, I sat on the kitchen floor, leaning against the cupboards. I felt completely overwhelmed, buried beneath worry and exhaustion. But even as I sat there, surrounded by bills and silence, I heard the soft creak of Emily's bedroom door. She peeked out and whispered, "Mom?" I took a deep breath, wiped my eyes, and stood up. "I'm okay," I lied gently. "Go back to bed, sweetheart." I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake listening to the soft sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant ticking of the hallway clock, and wondered how I would keep our life from falling apart. But what I didn't know then was that the greatest test, the one that would shake everything, was just around the corner. A moment that would change the path of our lives. The next morning, sunlight spilled gently through the kitchen window, softening the edges of the storm from the night before. Emily was already up, quietly drawing at the table, her small hands moving with focus and calm. For a moment, I just watched her, amazed at her resilience. How someone so small could carry grief with such quiet courage. Then the phone rang. My heart sank slightly. Bills, calls from work, more bad news, I thought. But when I picked it up, it was Thomas. He sounded cheerful, almost like someone who had slept through a bad storm and now saw the world with clearer eyes. "I know this is sudden," he said, "but there's a volunteer program through the local community center. They help with car repairs, bills, even groceries in emergency situations. I thought maybe it could help you." I blinked, stunned. Part of me wanted to say no, pride and exhaustion warring against need, but another part, the part that had been quietly crumbling under pressure, said yes. Thomas drove me and Emily to the center later that morning. The volunteers were warm and organized, offering not only practical help, but genuine kindness. A listening ear, understanding smiles, and small gestures that reminded us we weren't as alone as we had felt. By the afternoon, arrangements were made to repair the car at little or no cost, and a small grant had been approved to cover some overdue bills. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to breathe again. On the drive home, Emily leaned against my shoulder, smiling at a funny story Thomas told along the way. I glanced at her and realized that the storm hadn't gone. Not really. But the sunlight breaking through was more than metaphorical. It was real. There were challenges still ahead, yes, but we were no longer facing them in silence. Back at home, as I tucked Emily into bed that night, she whispered, "Mom, do you think things will get better?" I kissed her forehead and held her tight. "Yes, sweetheart, I really do." And for the first time in months, I believed it.